Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, those of you in person, those of you at home, joining by Zoom, for this special event about Camilo José Vergara's Pandemic Diary. I'll put the signal up there to go to our slides now, please. This is a very special event that's been sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation. The intention is to bring together MacArthur Genius Award grantees and non-geniuses like myself to have a conversation around their work, around our work. I'm very pleased that we've assembled this group today to discuss Camilo Vergara's Pandemic Diary project. I'm going to say more about Camilo in just a moment. For those of you who are in the field of urban studies, urban history, urban planning, architecture, you're probably already familiar with his work. He is really the foremost documentarian of American cities over time, often the most neglected, the most forgotten parts of American cities, places devastated by disinvestment and poverty. And this project now is his most recent effort of wandering, roaming, almost obsessively through the spaces of the city to document the conditions on the ground during these last 2 years, ever since March 2020. That's our topic today, and we have a terrific panel to discuss this topic. Let me quickly say this. You'll see on the screen there is a email address. We're conducting a bit of an experiment in which we are inviting you, not you right here in the room probably, because we don't have internet here for you to contribute, but please do take down the email address. But for those of you at home or watching on Zoom, if you have an image that represents the experience of the pandemic for you, would you please share it with us if you'd like to vergarapandemicdiary@gmail.com, and we're going to assemble and print and collage all of these images and kind of create our own spontaneous collective representation of the pandemic, our own new pandemic diary. So that's the email address up there. So let me introduce our panel. I'm going to start with Robert Beauregard, sitting next to Camilo over here. Robert Beauregard is Professor Emeritus at Columbia University, where he taught urban planning in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And Bob has previously taught at the New School, University of Pittsburgh and Rutgers. Bob Beauregard has written extensively on planning theory and urban theory. The former includes 2 recent books, Advanced Introduction to Planning Theory and Planning Matter, Acting with Things. And the latter includes Cities in the Urban Age, A Descent, and Voices of Decline, The Fate of Post-War U.S. Cities. His most recent projects include the co-edited Planning as Regulation and The Political Economy of Land. So thank you, Bob, for joining us. One of our original panelists, Laura Wexler, is now a new grandmother, and so she's not with us this evening. She's with her daughter and her grandson. But we are joined by another wonderful contributor, Amy Starecheski, who is a cultural anthropologist and oral historian whose research focuses on the use of oral history in social movements and the politics of history, value, and property in cities. Amy is the director of the Oral History MA program at Columbia University, and she's co-author of Telling Lives, Oral History Curriculum Guide. Amy was a lead interviewer on Columbia's September 11th, 2001 Narrative and Memory Project, and her book Hours to Lose, When Squatters Became Homeowners in New York City, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2016. She's also the founder of the Mott Haven Oral History Project, which collaboratively documents, activates, and amplifies the stories of her longtime neighborhood, as told by the people who live there. And immediately to my right is our second MacArthur Grant winner. This is Gregg Gonsalves. He's associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology of Microbial Diseases, at Yale School of Public Health, and an associate professor at the Yale Law School. At Yale, he also directs the Global Health Justice Partnership, an initiative of the Yale School of Public Health and Yale Law School, working at the intersections of health and human rights and social justice. He's a 2018 MacArthur Fellow and a recipient of a NIH, National Institutes of Health, Director's New Innovator Award for his work on substance use and infectious diseases. Gregg has been an AIDS activist for more than 30 years, first with ACT UP New York and then with numerous organizations in the United States and around the world. And I guess I should introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elihu Rubin. I'm Associate Professor of Architecture, Urbanism, and American Studies at Yale, and I'm very happy to be your host this evening. Camilo's current project that we're discussing this evening, the Pandemic Diary, is the latest in a long sequence of his tireless documentation of American cities. And this set of book covers is not exhaustive. It's suggestive of his work, from books like American Ruins, The New American Ghetto, Unexpected Chicagoland, Detroit is No Dry Bones, and Harlem, the unmaking of the ghetto, a story which follows some neighborhoods which begin to see reinvestment over time. But much of Camilo's work, as it's come to be received by urbanists, has been documenting in incredible detail, and not just the imagery, but also the history, the social history, interviews with people he meets on the ground, and his own observations, but his observations of this urbanism by subtraction, right? In places like Chicago, returning to the same place over many, many years to document how it's changed over time. Urbanism by subtraction in Chicago and in Detroit. And this practice of Camilo's is fascinating to those of us who are fascinated by everyday streetscapes of the city. And I'll just flip through these kind of quickly, of East 125th Street, starting in 1977 and working its way to the near present, to show how changes, those of us who are interested in these photographs from an urban perspective, how granular changes on the ground relate to deeper and broader urban changes at large. And for those of us fascinated by the material culture of the city, the social life of the city, these images are entrancing. This same technique of tracking time has now been applied in this project, the Pandemic Diary, to a set of locations in the New York area, which he calls the Crossroads. Many of them, not all of them, are suggested on this map. And these are all places that he has visited, and he'll tell us more about these locations and about his decision to address these particular locations. But right now, to get into it, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Camilo to say more about this project and to read an excerpt from the Pandemic Diary, so you can get a taste of the kind of work he's been doing. So Camilo, please.
Great. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So let's start with slide number 1. That was March 15th. The pandemic started on March 11th. And it was very interesting to look in the streets and to see that the people were trying to continue their lives that they led before. So the street vendors were there, they were out there in crowds. But then, let's see the next one. Then here is the first person I saw wearing a mask in one of the crossroads, because the places that I decided to go and photograph were places where urban life is lived in the most intensely, because it's where the subways come, where the buses come together, where shopping it's very active, and I figured those would be the places that would be the most telling in terms of the pandemic. Let's see the next one. And it just didn't take very long to have this tremendous tragedy sort of have an impact on the people as they presented themselves. You know, this sort of withdrawn, this sort of somber, this sort of anguish, not knowing what was coming. Here, you know, this was sort of a new scene. I mean, usually nurses that come out of Lincoln Hospital, you know, they take their stuff and, you know, they dress like civilian people, but she comes like the real, you know, the people who are going to be helping out to face this terrible tragedy. And she's all set there, you know. Then the subways, this is sequentially by time, we're still in March. You see how people held their hands, how their faces show that apprehension, that lack of knowledge, and then the sense of responsibility, because you are not alone. You are responsible for your children, for your grandchildren, for your babies, and what's going to happen to them. And then I began to see the signs that were all over the place, you know, that people would put them really quickly. Some of them were, the intention was to sort of limit the effects of the virus. How do you mitigate the virus? The other ones were simply saying, look, we're just moving out, we're closing. But not just that, adding, we don't know when we're coming, we don't know if we're coming, and God help you. This is extraordinary, is that throughout the pandemic, the places that they check cashing places and the places where people went to do remittances continue to be very busy. So this is one in Queens. We're still in the first and second month of the pandemic. Let's see. And then, of course, the mask became integrated with the whole idea of design, of style, of, you know, sort of assertive your individuality. So one of the first things would be your nationality, your origin, in this case, Puerto Rico. And the other one was, you know, how do you make a beautiful thing that will protect you too? And here is a couple that are all decked out for this new period, and that had to do with the mixture of the cloth mask with the sunglasses, you know, that became very popular. You saw it over and over again. It's the first time. I mean, you know, I think all of you experienced this, the ambulances, the sound of ambulances everywhere. But what was very peculiar about this was not a New York ambulance. These were the ambulances that were coming. This one was coming from South Carolina to help out New Yorkers because they were short of ambulances at that time. And I believe the woman being put in was in really bad shape. Her head went down, and behind, not in the picture, is the men carrying a little bag with their clothes. And you can imagine all the people that were put in ambulances with a little bag with their clothes, and that was it. Let's see. And here's the first mention of the virus as some kind of punishment that comes from God to us. And the lines that you saw, this is in Bed-Stuy, in Brooklyn, and you see people, and they did respect this. They kept the lines, and they waited, and families stayed together, and then there was a guard there. But the thing that I found very interesting was the flowers. Throughout that whole period, flowers were very important. Let's see the next one. The homeless, of course, had the pandemic of their own that was different, and it was a pandemic of their own, so that it's like every group sort of faced the pandemic in a different way. So for the homeless, it had they could have a whole subway car to themselves. So you would see this, and there'll be nobody else in that car. And the police that would come around, sometimes they would just click with their keys on the window, so as to tell them that there was still police, but they wouldn't get them out. Here you can see, on the one hand, is the kids in 138th in the Bronx, just after 6 weeks or 7 weeks of the pandemic, just taking to the streets, and they're all wearing masks, which is it was very surprising to me. And next to it is the naked cowboy with an empty Times Square. That's it. That of course, there was the time when the essential workers, used to be celebrated, and people would get their pots and pans out the window. But this one said, pay us more. I don't care if you clap or not. That's it. Here you see in Queens, this is the Corona Queens, probably the place that was where the pandemic hit the worst. And you see the people, of course, they needed to be outside. They needed to know that the world was still functioning, but that had its rules, and you had to respect those rules. So they're sitting, keeping that distance between themselves. And here are all this, they used the sign there, which was very dramatic, and the sort of the suit to insulate yourself, and controlling the people going in and out of the store. And of course, I asked him, and he said people didn't pay attention to him; they would go anyway. And next to him is the people that started accumulating certain things, like paper towels in this case, but there were many other things that you had trouble finding in the stores. And, you begin to adapt to this pandemic. How do you get a haircut? You can get a haircut in the street, so you can get it in the front yard of your house. Or and how do you, the store that can't sell anything, but what it can sell stuff out in the streets, but it can only sell things like sanitizer and masks. These are the essential workers, of course. That at that time they couldn't even get the right kind of mask. Let's see the next one. And of course, many people had to find food. So all over the city there were these food distribution places, and it was a very complicated thing. Sometimes they had to wait 3-4 hours. They had to be there with their children. But eventually the truck would come in and they would get food sometimes for 2-3 days. It's when the subways were beginning to be cleaned, and that was an extraordinary sight to see them there. But also what was extraordinary, this is the L train at the end on 8th Avenue. And it's that the people themselves were aware of that they were playing what they call a historical role. So this sense, we lived all our lives, you know, and then all of a sudden history catches up with us, you know. So for her, that was very important. Also, birthdays were very important. You know, it's here, it's this terrible thing is happening, but you have to celebrate your birthday. Then, of course, there's testing and the plastic. You know, there's plastic that to isolate, that will keep the virus, that would keep from coming in. The same adaptation. So you can't have a restaurant. So you sell something outside, hoping that that will tie you through. The line of people waiting for food. And then the surprising thing is that it took a real long time before you began to see signs that the people who had died were remembered. And that was the first time I saw it, and that was in Corona, Queens. And there were these wonderful pictures, you know, that people had taken of themselves when they were really enjoying life. Let's see it. And here you see a whole selection of images that have to do with vaccination. I wanted to show how vaccination evolved from being in big places like the gym and the school, or the Navy Yards in Brooklyn, or then big buses that would be parked in the middle of a plaza, and the signs that came with it, and the gift of $100 if you get vaccinated, and finally to the vaccination to the children. So. And similarly, it's true of testing. Testing was often done in a place, in a tent adjacent to a hospital. Then there were special vans that were out there on the streets where testing was performed. In Newark, they would put those containers, shipping containers. And finally, testing was done in those bubbles, in those little bubbles that you see in the last picture. And it was sort of an irony, you know, it was New York sort of being filled with tents and bubbles, and at the same time the office buildings were being empty. So here, New York was becoming a city of bubbles. Let's see. The schools that had, you know, they had to communicate all this tremendous changes that were happening. You know, first they had to close. So they had to tell everybody, stay safe. You know, the school it's closed. And then there were all the signs, you know, that sign of the face with a mask that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. And then the signs in English, in Spanish, in Arabic, and, you know, it was so confusing. And then the need to celebrate graduation. You couldn't pass that up, you know, you graduated, you can't ignore it. And then the irony of some of these things, you know, like the last of the pictures that says, this is where dreams are made. School is closed. And then there are the after effects of this thing, which is the phase in which we're in now. The first one has to do with carrying Naxalon with you because somebody may get, you know, some kind of poison through use of fentanyl. Then the one below it, it's about this increase in anxiety, and now they want to check all the kids in school for anxiety level. And there's just some kind of bogus number. They're 43% more anxiety, which I don't know how you find out. But you see how all of that's related, because below there is the COVID, is the sign of the virus. And then, up it goes to that anxiety level. And finally, there is one about Alzheimer's and amnesia that asks you a question, if you forget things, do you forget things? Which of course has to do with the situation of so many people that had to isolate themselves, that at a particular time when they needed to get some help, that whatever was happening to them could be slowed down, and they couldn't see a doctor or speak to people and so on. So I think that's the last one. And I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank Elihu for putting this together in a sort of heroic way. And it was wonderful, and it's wonderful that all of my friends came, and you are here.
I want to turn to our panel now, and to Bob first. I wonder if it would be appropriate to spin the image, the video again of the pictures while Bob is speaking. If possible, we could try that. Go back to that MP4. But I want to turn to the panelists for some comments and reactions, and start with you, Bob.
Well, I want to comment on very briefly on three visual elements that appear in these photographs: the people, the settings or the places, including the buildings, and objects. And as regards these photographs, I think it's the objects that are most important, because it's the objects, the things you see in these photographs, that mark them as images taken at the time of the pandemic. It's the mask, it's the sidewalk stickers that put you 6 feet apart, it's the window signs that limit the number of hungry patrons that can go into a pizza shop, it's the surgical gloves that you saw people wearing, it's the pop-up testing sites. This is what changed in public life when the pandemic happened. Neither the settings or buildings nor the people changed. I mean, in contrast, compare these images to images you see now of what's happening in cities in the Ukraine and what happened to seaside communities in Florida as a result of the recent hurricane. You saw buildings destroyed. You saw debris piled up in the streets. You don't see that here. Or, as far as people, think about the images you see of people in a famine, right? They've changed, right? But in these images, the settings and the people didn't change from before the pandemic. What changed was that we're seeing objects, anomalous in normal times, that have become ubiquitous. And these objects are what define the pandemic visually in Vergara's work. Now this is important because these objects are very ephemeral. They're likely to disappear, and we're likely to lose the material memory of the pandemic. Fewer and fewer people are wearing masks, window signs will be taken down, the decals on the sidewalk will weather and wear away. Unlike a war or a hurricane or a famine, a pandemic leaves little visual trace. As a rhetorical question, ask yourself in your daily life how many times you see things, anything, that reminds you of the pandemic of 1918. You don't. It was only 2 weeks ago that someone actually pointed one of these things out to me. They exist, There are certain cemeteries in Queens that are known as pandemic cemeteries because of the 1918 pandemic. I didn't know that. I never knew that until recently. And while the people in these images are not physically different from before the pandemic, they do look different, but only because of the mask. And they did act differently, but only because there were signs that said you have to stand 6 feet away from someone else. And what we don't see in these images, and I want to talk about what we see and what we don't see. What we don't see in these images is the trauma of the pandemic and the burdens it imposed on people. A lost job, a death in the family, extended sickness, household budget suddenly insufficient to buy food or pay the rent. We do see some indicators of this. For example, in the lines outside the food kitchen. But in these neighborhoods, food kitchens existed before the pandemic and will exist after the pandemic. They've been there. Lines are a bit longer. The food kitchens are a little bit larger, but there's not a qualitative change. Camilo mentioned something also that's important about these images, which you can kind of see, at least I see it. One of them is that they show the willingness of people to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. Most people did wear masks. Most people did queue properly. Most people took advantage of the testing sites. They listened to what the government was telling them about COVID-19, and they acted responsibly. This is good news, right? These images also show, and Camilo mentioned this also, the resourcefulness of people. The store owners installed takeaway windows. The street vendors erected plastic and plexiglass screens so they could sell their goods. Entrepreneurs bought testing kits and masks and wholesale and sold them on the sidewalks. People acted to keep their businesses and their livelihoods intact. They were resilient. More good news. Looking at these images also makes me think about the extent to which the vulnerability to disasters is unequally distributed across the population. Now, when I look at these images, I don't see the most vulnerable people in our society. As you might surmise if you were to look at, for example, images of homeless encampments in Los Angeles. That's a wholly different group of people. But they're not the least vulnerable either. The least vulnerable fled to their country homes, worked remotely from home so that they could keep their income secure. They had their groceries delivered, and if COVID-19 struck, they had medical insurance, and they had contacts in the medical community, and they could easily survive the sickness. Then there's place. The places do look different from what they did before the pandemic, but again, I'm hammering away at this point, but only because of the things of the pandemic that have been placed there. Once these things are removed, which they will be, these places will look as they did before. In effect, the pandemic has not had and will not have a long-term lasting impact on the urban built environment. This shouldn't come as a surprise. One of the things we know about natural disasters and wars that devastate places is that the places are often rebuilt to reflect what was there before. I mean, architects and planners might think, oh, what a great opportunity. We can do a totally new world, but that's not what happens. Having endured a disaster, people want to return to normalcy. And property and business owners want to maintain their income-producing assets as they were before. Disasters might pose opportunities for politicians and for certain business owners. Think of the construction industry. But for most people, they're decidedly not an opportunity to rethink how and where to live. In this matter, people in places are inherently conservative. One last comment. I mentioned earlier some of what we don't see in these images. The consequence of lost jobs and incomes, pandemic deaths and sicknesses, stunted child development caused by closed schools, the trauma and chaos in intensive care units and nursing homes, the damage caused to state and city government finances, the failure of small businesses, and the corruption as people exploited pandemic relief funding. To the extent that these things could actually be visually captured, other photographers have documented these aspects of the pandemic. What Vergara has done, what Camilo has done, is not the whole of the pandemic, and that's too much to ask of anyone. Nonetheless, he's documented the public side of the pandemic, and this is quite important.
Thank you, Bob. And I was going to turn it over to Amy now. And we want to go back to your...
Yeah, I think there's some slides that I can talk about a bit.
That'd be great. If we could switch back again to the presentation. I'll get to the... Yeah, that's right here. It's just the next slides.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here as a longtime fan of Camilo's work. And so what I'd like to do briefly in my comments is connect some of this work into that longer thread of documentary photography. And the way I want to do that is by talking about time and the flow of time and the relationship between history and archives, and how the pandemic was is still a really special moment in terms of how we think about time. So I'm an oral historian, and it wasn't in my bio, but I was one of the co-directors of the New York City COVID-19 Oral History Narrative and Memory Project. And for that project, we started doing oral history with New Yorkers in March of 2020. We started out then and interviewed almost 200 people, went back and interviewed them again 3 to 6 months later, and then interviewed a subset again 2 years after that. And we did that in part because we think of oral history as a conversation about the past that's happening in the present and that's oriented towards the future. And part of what I study as an anthropologist who works in oral history is how people take all of the raw materials of the past and turn them into something that they can use to make sense of what's happening in the world around them. And so we were really excited to see in this moment when the future suddenly became inscrutable, where the futures we had expected to happen seemed to disappear. I have a calendar from 2020 where every single thing is crossed off and there's a whole nother schedule written aside it, starting in early March. And I think a lot of us had that feeling that we expected there to be a path, and all of a sudden it disappeared and we didn't really know what was going to happen next. And it happened so quickly and changed our sense of time and flow through time. And so if you see these pictures of Third Avenue in the Bronx, the first one's around 1980. Is that 81? And typically, Camilo would go back to the same site every year, every couple years, and photograph it. And so we see buildings in these pictures changing in ways that are striking and jarring and incredibly interesting, but relatively slow. Whereas in the work that you were doing during the pandemic, you're going back to the same places every day and seeing things change day by day, hour by hour. We were kind of in this moment where it felt like time had speeded up. And I think it's so interesting to see how that sense of speeding up is really reflected in a shift in your practices as a documentary photographer. So if we look, most of the work in this collection is not as a social scientist, what I think of as longitudinal, what you call sequential, right? But there's one series that I wanted to look at together of a pizza place on 149th Street in the Hub, which maybe we'll see. Oh, maybe it's gone. I can describe the pictures a little bit while we're seeing if maybe they're there. And it's interesting to me because I recognize this pizza. I live near there, and I recognize this pizza place immediately because it has this really striking sign that just says pizza in really bright colors. It looks kind of old-fashioned. But the photographs actually aren't zooming in on the on the sign and the building, they're zooming in on the people, and the way that people are interacting with this space day after day, week after week, really drastically changing. And so I think you also see a shift here from a focus on buildings to a focus on people. There it is. People and how they're moving through space, and the objects that are surrounding them. And so, this project focuses in on crossroads as places where I think you've written a little bit in some of the text that goes along with it about crossroads as places where everything kind of accelerates, and that's part of why you're focusing on crossroads spaces, right? I also think of crossroads as places where you can kind of choose to go in any direction. So I think that's another interesting resonance in this project, is that especially the early days of the pandemic, we really did not know what was going to happen next. And we designed this whole oral history project thinking we would go back to people 18 months in to get to hear them reflect back on what the pandemic had meant to them now that it was safely in the past. And of course, that's not what we're living through at all. And so, I think we can think of crossroads as particularly dynamic in that sense, that you can go multiple different places. And I think that thinking of these photographs as taking this very lively, kind of disorderly feeling, uncertain present, and fixing it in some way. And as soon as you take a picture, that moment becomes part of the past. This is a collection that's not explicitly framed as an archive, but as an anthropologist and an oral historian, I'm reading it that way, as a way of kind of trying to think about what we might want to remember from this time, chiming in on what you're saying. What are the things that we might otherwise forget? And so I'm so grateful that these photographs exist and can allow us to remember things that I'm already starting to forget, especially about what those early months were like. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there's more to say when we're in conversation, but I'm eager to hear what's on your mind in looking at these images.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Amy. Gregg.
So, I'm not an urbanist, I'm not a photographer, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm just an epidemiologist.
Just the most important thing you can be
But I don't have a language like many of the people in this room to describe what I saw. But all I can tell you is that I feel it desperately overwhelming. As I said this morning, I went through 2020 and I couldn't go further because it is all-consuming what I saw, right? And I think if you go through the diary, you will get that sense of sort of this tidal wave of images, but also emotions that start to come back that we all might have felt in 2020. I want to take you back a little bit further. I used to live in New York City and worked at the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was set up in the context of another pandemic, the HIV pandemic. And when I got there, they said, "You're going to work on HIV prevention." And I said, "Well, I deal with treatment stuff. I don't want to do it." Said, "You're going to deal with that." And I said, "I got to figure out how to respond to this." And I talked to two friends of mine at Columbia, Mindy and Bob Fullilove, who were in the School of Public Health. And they said, "We can come down and do a training for you." And they said, "Get some cameras." I'm like, "What?" "Get some disposable cameras." And we had 50 people in the room from around the city. And Mindy said, "Go out for 2 hours, and I want you to take pictures of this neighborhood that we are working in right now." And she didn't tell us why, right? But they said, "Photograph whatever you want, buildings, people, streetscapes, whatever." We came back and she said, "Now tell me what this means to you in the context of HIV prevention." I still wasn't getting it. But what Mindy and Bob tried to explain to us is that the landscape of risk and safety in epidemiological terms is written in the world around us. And originally I said, "Why don't we do this in a poor neighborhood where HIV is much more prevalent right now in terms of the risk?" They said, "No, do it in Chelsea. You think it's a white, middle-class, gay neighborhood, but there's something else there." And as we had started to talk about what we saw in those pictures, we realized if you scratch the surface of that neighborhood, there was a lot of things underneath that threw people into the path of oncoming epidemics and provided safety. And so when I look at these pictures, I flash back a little bit because this is a landscape of risk and safety, right? There are three things I just want to mention that occurred to me in the 2020 portion of these pictures. One is masks. I'm wearing a mask now. I wore one for most of 2021 and into this year. But I didn't feel like the first months of the pandemic really were central to my life in terms of masks, right? Where was I? I was sitting at home in Worcester Square. I was ordering on Peapod and Amazon. I spent a life inside, right? And this is all about public life. It's people who had to go outside, right? To get to work, to open their shops, to take their kids to the doctor. And so you see this whole sort of different aspect of the pandemic that I didn't experience here in New Haven. And I bet many people in New York City who had the means not to actually go out and venture to the city in those early months experienced as well. So there's two kinds of risks and that we saw and see in these pictures that are recapitulated by class, race, gender, etc. The other thing is CityMD. There is so much CityMD in this first year. Where were people getting tested? They weren't going to a primary care physician or to Yale Health or to their local doctor. They were going to for-profit medical enterprises that could give them quick turnaround on PCR tests. My sister did it, who lives in Brooklyn and lives in Grand Army Plaza. Anytime she got exposed, she'd go to CityMD down the block. So all of a sudden, there's another climate of risk that we're talking about, risk and safety. Where do you get your health care? Do you get it at CityMD, or do you know a doctor at Yale New Haven Hospital or Columbia Presbyterian, right? The landscapes of risk and safety are right in front of you in these pictures of CityMD as sort of the central spot in the first year where people are looking for answers about what's going on in their lives. And then there were two pictures that in the first year that stood out to me. There's a table of Black Lives Matter activists giving out masks and sanitizer in one of these pictures. And then there are two pictures of the New York State Department of Health set up, and they're giving out information. There's no commodities on the table. There's no masks, no sanitizer. There's nothing that the state is giving away.
Test.
To do this, and it's interesting to see how risk and safety is created by communities and the state itself, right? New York State was telling you where you could get tested, where you could get this, where you could get that. There was one picture that said, "Oh, we're not doing contact tracing anymore." Well, what are you doing? But out on the street, people were selling masks, selling sanitizer, or giving it away for free as they run those Black Lives Matter photographs. So it goes back to what Mindy and Bob taught me many years ago, that just go out and look, and you'll see the environments of risk and safety all around you, not just for COVID, but for HIV, for all the things that determine how long we live, whether we're going to be at risk of one disease or another, or in the path of this pandemic.
Thank you, Gregg, and thanks to all of the panelists for these reactions. And I really do want to now open this up to all of you in the audience here, and also on Zoom using the Q&A function if you like as well. Ingrid, you could signal me if anything is popping up there. And I think that we'll be able to get you a microphone if you do have a question. So just raise your hand and we'll do that. But while you're thinking about a question or a comment, I wanted just to turn back to Camilo and ask you if you wanted to respond to any of what we've just heard, any of these different comments raising different issues, the seen and the unseen, the archive in compression, if you will, in this case, and what Gregg is seeing in some of these photographs as well in terms of access to healthcare, for example, or what the state is doing, how government is speaking, and how everyday people are responding.
Well, I think some the pictures are complex. There is a lot in a picture, that may show some of the things that Bob didn't find them, but there may be some of the after effects, or some of the that are still present with the picture. To me, you know, I was there not knowing what I was going to photograph. So it was very difficult to see what I was going to find the next day or the day after. And I look, you know, where people gather, where people went, what people were trying to do, and why was that important. And I try to feel how different issues sort of evolve and moved, you know, each one of them was very, very moving, you know, like with the schools, you know, first the school's closed, then the school is open, you know, for remote, for a couple of days a week, and then remote the rest, and you know, and then who can go in? People need to be vaccinated, and all of that. So I'm still responding to all this material. I'm still, and I will be responding to the comments here, because I think I'm going to go over this thing, and I'm going to be thinking about this and seeing how what every one of you have said relates to what I saw and photographed.
I think it's true that the images can be appreciated individually. You could savor one image for a very long time to begin to analyze what you're seeing there, and then, as Gregg's describing it, there's also a kind of avalanche of imagery, and you see it in the serial fashion, Amy, that you're suggesting. I mean, and right now, of course, the way that the diary is organized is both over time, by season, and by theme. So it's both, in a sense, as you track the themes over time. Yeah, I'm wondering, Amy, maybe you have a thought about this, how you might suggest one, two, or several ways for us to begin to assess the material in terms of from the individual to the serial, for example.
I mean, I think it's really fascinating to see how each of us saw something different in the same set of images. And for me, it makes me feel inspired to go out into the world and look at these places again and look at them differently, and pay attention to the things that we're not noticing anymore. You know, I used to go into a store, and before I went in, so carefully scrutinize what signs are up there. And now I just breeze in and don't, you know, I don't even check, because I figure, oh, those signs are old or they're not relevant anymore. And so I think at this point it feels very personal. And I think it feels also different, you know, for a person who was in New York during this time. There's a sense of feeling, I think, especially overwhelmed to kind of relive it, versus if you weren't in New York and it's more, you know, showing something new, something that maybe a lot of these are the kinds of images that, you know, we weren't seeing on the news at that time, of the more everyday impact.
Right. Bob, were you going to jump in?
I'm trying to decide whether to jump in or not. I was going to say, a little bit glibly, that my approach is like a literary theory approach. I believe in reader response theory, which is you look at an image, the image is not talking to you, you're talking to the image. You're bringing something to the image.
Right.
Gregg did that, Amy did that, Camilo does that, I did that, right? There's an interaction that's going on here. You just can't think of the image as independent of your understanding of the world you live in. And this goes not just for these kind of documentary images, it also goes for the kinds of art images, art photographs, which Camilo always says, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not doing art photographs. And although his photographs are quite good, if you know anything about photographs. You know, this is not like a Stephen Shore image or you know, something like that that's very meant to be artistic. You know, these are the kinds of the images that we can relate to in some way, right? And when we're looking at these images, we have to think about how we're relating to it and how we're not relating to it, right? And this is also, the other side of this is a kind of critical theory approach to it, of looking at what's hidden from us, of what we hide from ourselves, in looking at the images. And that's why I wanted to emphasize all of the things that the images don't show, because I really think this is important in this larger project. He's doing a piece of this to remind us in the future that this was important, you know?
Absolutely, and you know, I think I relate to what you're saying. That's right. Everyone will see something different in it, and of course, the reception of imagery depends on the context. If we picked 10 of these pictures and put it in a fancy gallery, then we would be talking about them as Stephen Shore images, for example, or some other photographer working in that vein. And so, in the context of the diary, when I look at the images, I'm feeling Camilo. In every picture, it's his body on the scene in every single case. There's a series of images in the diary that are different pieces of tags or street art or graffiti or whatever you might want to call them. And Camilo is saying to me, you know, this is the way in which the street artists are beginning to show the virus. You know, you have a tag that is shedding virus. And I say, Camilo, what are you talking about? This is not this is you looking for the virus. And when you look for the virus, you find the virus. You find it everywhere. And that's, I think, the invitation here is to continue to look carefully. But when you review the pandemic diary images, and of course they're on the Library of Congress, and ultimately the project will be published as well. I'd be very curious to hear your reactions to those images. Is this the virus coming out in the everyday street art of the city? Or is this Camilo looking for the virus and finding it in all of these different places, and why we need him as another kind of essential worker here to draw this out for us?
No, I'm glad you brought that, because what I'm really looking for is, I know that there are these people, these thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands and more. Many of them had relatives that died, had, you know, sometimes really close to them, really near. And this must have created in them this sort of, they want to know what killed my grandma, what killed my father. You know, why am I an orphan? There is a damn bug out there that is killing us. And I want to give it form. I want to give it shape. And in many of these images, it says COVID-19, or it says curfew, or it has some reference, you know, besides, of course, the droplets and so on. So I'm looking for that personal response of those thousands of New Yorkers and people from New Jersey, you know, who responded to this.
Yeah. Are there? Yeah, please. I see a question here. Can we bring the mic down over here for a question? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. This was fascinating. I just have a question for Camilo, which is, how did people feel about you photographing them when you were out on the street? Did you talk to any of them? What were their?
Well, that picture comes up all the time. I mean, a couple of times I was almost beaten up. In fact, it was on the subway, and at the beginning, and it was all, you know, I thought this was really an important picture. It's like the third day the pandemic is declared, subway car full of people, and I get there, and of course, to take the picture that shows most people, you got to take it with the camera up here, so everybody sees you taking the picture. So there was, you know, someone screams and he says, erase that picture, and you know, I'm erase all your pictures, stop taking pictures. And of course, you go there and I do it. And then it just, you figure something else is going to come. But you have to make the choice somewhere. Are you going to do this? How can you ask 50 people? How can you ask 100 people? I wanted to show people crossing the streets. I wanted to show people crossing the streets in as many places of this sort of segregated New York as I could, so that there would be that evidence. People could look not just in one place and so on. And I could not ask every one of them that was crossing the street, what are you doing? And sometimes I even took sneaky pictures, and if they'd asked me to erase them, I erased them. And sometimes other people would come in and say, look, what you did is wrong. You should have asked. And I would sort of agree with it. But I thought, on the one hand is the value of the document that you're creating, and on the other hand is respect for the people. So, and sometimes you don't have time to explain this. And sometimes the things heat up. So you know that there is a kind of limit that when people are not rational about an issue anymore, and then what you need to do is just move out as quickly as you can and get out of there. So
I think there's a question on Zoom that Ingrid's going to go ahead and read for us.
Yeah, so this question is for Camilo. It reads, your attention is itself a kind of healing and a kind of public health. How do you represent where we are now that coronavirus has been individualized and medicalized and the impacts are less visible, given that those most affected are often isolated at home, when work and school have abandoned online access, and when few people are still masked or distancing?
somebody else.
Could you just read the beginning again? I didn't quite hear that.
All right. Okay. How do you represent where we are now that coronavirus has been individualized and medicalized, and the impacts are less visible?
Does any of you can handle that better than I can? I can.
Greg, do you have a response to that?
So there's a pink poster that says, it's in the panel, it says something about protecting each other, right? So the New York State Metropolitan Transport Authority had, let's protect each other. And then like 2 weeks ago or a month ago, they came up with a new slogan, which is called "You Do You," right? And they started doing jokey versions of their mask advertisements like this, on the side of the face. It became a big joke, right? It's not a joke if you're immunocompromised and you can't leave your house. It's not a joke to the 390 people who died yesterday from COVID-19 in the United States, right? So this is history, but it's a testament, right? It's a testament to what happened and what's continuing to happen. And we were talking before we sat down about the will to forget. There's a huge will to forget right now. And we keep talking about the pandemic in the past tense. It's happening right now. A 9/11 happens every week in the United States, right? Think of the Twin Towers dropping every week in the United States. That's how many people are dying. While the suffering goes on in private, the public sphere has now been sort of stripped of all these physical objects that we're talking about that signify what we went through, what we're continuing to go through.
Well, just to extend Greg's comments in a way he might not like, but I don't know that. Look, we're a country that values individualism, and we're a country that turns away from institutional factors in thinking about things like poverty and racism and disease and risk and all of those things. And that's, I think, for me, that's just like a bedrock aspect of this world of American society. And it's exacerbated by kind of political discussions we've been having, and I've been reading a lot of books about the right wing lately and Republicans. And, you know, not to name anyone who's to blame for this, but I would blame the Republicans and the right wing, you know, that keep exacerbating this kind of individualistic approach to problems.
Yeah, but on the other hand, everywhere you had posters addressing people in New York, hey Bronx, hey Brooklyn, you know, so we were one. We shared the character of being from New York. So I think the health department and the city, they play both sides. They play the individual as well as the other one. I think at the beginning, I was amazed because to create that sense, you know, they used to play Frank Sinatra. You know, New York, New York, this wonder, if you can make it in anywhere, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. So.
Can I?
Which is a highly individualist comment. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Right.
But Camilo, are you still making photographs in this series? Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think to like put a finer point on that question, like what are you photographing these days? What are you seeing that visualizes the pandemic in this stage that helps us to put it in public space?
Well, what I'm seeing, for instance, that people in buses tend to wear masks much more often. I'm seeing that in some of the crossroads, it seems to be that people are being more careful. But if you see in places where a lot of tourists are together, such as Soho, Broadway and Prince, or the Statue of Liberty Ferry, you see that people are a lot less careful.
Are there other questions out in the audience here? Yeah, I see one right there. Can we bring a mic there? Thank you.
Well, this is really incredible. So I'm from New York, and like seeing this was really reminiscent for me because I actually graduated. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I graduated during the pandemic. So like I was a senior in 2020, and I was like inside and watching you move through these hubs. I'm from Sunnyside, Queens, so this was like extremely near Jackson Heights, underneath the 7 train. Reminded me of I got in trouble with my mom because I tried to go out and protest during the pandemic. She was really concerned for like my grandma's health, my own health, my family's health. So my question for you, Camilo, is were you concerned for your own health during these photographs? Were you scared? What was going through your mind taking these pictures?
Insanity, you would say, but what happened is that I was faced with this thing. Do I stay alone in my 1-bedroom apartment and not do what I like to do all the time, which is just go around the city and look and see and photograph. And of course I knew that I could that this could kill me. I'm 78 years old. So that then my daughter took up the telling everybody to stop talking to me and to stop doing this thing. I think Elihu here received some emails from her, so did the Library of Congress. So at one point I got a package from the Library of Congress with one of those things that measure the oxygen in your blood, which I haven't opened the package. But I don't know, maybe I was just lucky. I mean, I have never had COVID yet. I thought many times that I had it, and I thought that was going to be the end. But, I just thought that I had to continue with this.
But you were careful. You were careful when you wrote.
Somewhat, but you couldn't be careful in certain situations. It was impossible to be careful. I mean, if you get in a bus in Newark, the buses, they were full. They were full of people, and and if you try to be careful, then they would make fun of you, and then when getting into a bus in Newark. I just decided not to go in because it was too full, and then somebody from the bus said, "Oh, he has COVID," so that I had it.
It's a very good question, actually, because I think that Camilo's family was very concerned about him getting sick, and so for those of us who were, working with him or encouraging him, it was our fault for encouraging him to go out here to do those things when we weren't taking the same risks. It really was, it resonated. I think it was true. And I went to Camilo too to make sure he knew that, we were concerned. But in a way, it wasn't other people encouraging him to go out to do these. This is his calling. I mean, this is what Camilo does. There's nothing that we could do to stop him from doing it. And I think that, I'm very grateful that you haven't gotten sick during all this time, of course, and that we now have this archive to continue to analyze. Right now, as it keeps growing, but over time, I think it's wonderful that the Library of Congress has decided that this is part of our history that needs to be preserved, and why I'm so grateful for the panel and their different perspectives, because I think it's just an indication of how many ways it might be read depending on the questions that you want to ask about it. And even more, and why I think it's so important to have more and more events like these and in more places, but in some sense to give the pictures back to the places from which they were taken. And I think it's wonderful to gather here at Yale and in New Haven and to take the opportunity to analyze it from different perspectives. But ultimately, the work belongs as much to the people who are its subject as it does to anyone else. And I hope there'll be more and more occasions to continue to discuss it. If there's any further questions or comments, we have time for a few more. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So I was just going to point out the poster board is done.
Oh, look at that! So this is very nice. I'll bring this up. We actually have managed in just this time to collect our own spontaneous, collective pandemic diary of images that have come through the email address, which you see on the board from, I guess, mostly people on Zoom, and thank you for participating. This is really beautiful and was something that we'll look at, those of us right here, and I hope we'll continue to build, because, of course, the pandemic diary it's Camilo's diary, it's the diary of all of the people at all of the crossroads, but every person has had their own experience. And all of those experiences are worthy of remembering and documenting too. So this is sort of our own modest way of evoking that, let's say. With that, I think I'll bring it to a close. Is there something lingering here? Yeah. Oh, please ask the question. Yeah.
I was wondering if we can comment from another perspective of the pandemic, and that is included in the old adage, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times.
Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. I know as a father of a family that our family had time together and a reunification, and We learned how to be bored together and play bocce. You know, we never played bocce together. But we came together in a almost kind of very... the circumstances never would have arisen for us all to be home, and I forbid my daughter to go back to New York City. And but the times that we had, and the kind of dinners, and the kind of community that, and simple times in nature, and those things were absolutely, I'm sure, not many people in their lifetimes could have experienced something as beautiful as, and yet tragic, of course, as well.
I'm sure you're right, except that I would say that at the beginning, when I don't know if you can share fear, I don't know if you can share extreme fear, when you know, I mean, being together is a wonderful thing, and having a meal together, and you know, feeling that you're part of something much larger than you are. But on the other hand, there is also, you know, the pandemic could have killed us all. It could have killed a whole lot more people than it did. And it, you know, and it's not over. So there was a period when it was really not the best of times.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It was really stimulating. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you to Camilo, to Bob, to Amy, to Gregg. And I want to thank all of the students that have helped me organize this. And I want to thank Liz and the Yale University Art Gallery staff and everyone up in the control booth and everyone who's helped us put this together. We really appreciate it, and it was really, really worthwhile to have this gathering. So thank you all so much, and yeah, we send in your photographs and stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.